History is loaded with absolutely mind-blowing examples of human credulity, and when it comes to cults, the sheer audacity of some groups makes your wildest nightmares look like bedtime stories. We're about to dive into 33 of the most shocking, twisted, and yes, wildest cults that history has desperately tried to bury. These aren't your run-of-the-mill religious movements. These are the full-blown, what were they thinking? Disasters that challenged everything. We thought we knew about human nature and common sense. Now let me be clear here when I say cult. I'm talking about groups with leaders who wielded dangerous levels of control over their followers, often ending in tragedy, violence, or both. These are the organizations that took devotion to terrifying extremes, where blind faith became something much darker and far more destructive. Many people visit Florida in the summer each year without even knowing that there used to be a cult, where a state park stands today in the late 19th century, the Koreshan Unity. A utopian community founded by Cyrus Teed, settled in Florida, believing the earth was hollow. This group literally thought we were living on the inside of a giant sphere, and that the universe was contained within the Earth's shell. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern physicist. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about groups that convinced their followers to drink poison because a comet was coming. Groups that stockpiled chemical weapons in Japan. Groups that murdered hundreds of people in Uganda because the apocalypse didn't arrive on schedule. And secret societies that influenced world events from the shadows for centuries. The psychological manipulation involved in these cults is absolutely staggering. You've got to admit it's wild that individuals are capable of brainwashing entire groups of people to such an extreme that they'd abandon everything they've ever known and lose grasp on the difference between good and evil. These leaders didn't just convince people to follow them, they convinced people to die for them, to kill for them, and to sacrifice their children for twisted visions of paradise. What makes these cults particularly chilling is how they preyed on fundamental human needs, the need for belonging, purpose, meaning, and hope. In an uncertain world, they offered answers to life's biggest questions, then slowly twisted those answers into something unrecognizable, something deadly. They created alternate realities, where up was down, black was white, and murder was salvation. The Order of the Solar Temple, or simply the Solar Temple, was a new religious movement, and secret society often described as a cult notorious for the mass deaths of many of its members in several mass murders and suicides throughout the 1990s. This group convinced wealthy, educated professionals to burn themselves alive, believing they would transcend to another planet behind the Hale-Bopp comet. Then there's Aum Shinrikyo, better known by their former name, is a Japanese new religious movement and doomsday cult founded by Shoko Asahara. In 1987, it carried out the deadly Tokyo subway sarin attack in 1995 and was found to have been responsible for the Matsumoto sarin attack the previous year. Imagine commuting to work and suddenly being exposed to a deadly nerve agent because a cult leader thought it would speed up the apocalypse. But perhaps one of the most heartbreaking examples is the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. A religious movement founded by Credonia Mwerinda and Joseph Kibwetir in southwestern Uganda, notorious for the mass death of several hundred members of the group in a mass suicide or mass murder in the year 2000. When their predicted doomsday failed to materialize, the leaders decided to manufacture their own apocalypse. What's particularly disturbing about these groups is how they evolved from seemingly legitimate spiritual movements into engines of destruction. Many members of the OTs were wealthy and socially successful. In contrast to many other cults, members were often middle-aged professionals who were highly cultured. This drew from its approach, elitist and interested in aesthetics, with a religious view that was non-fundamentalist. These weren't desperate people on society's fringes. These were doctors, lawyers, teachers, successful business people. The Order of the Solar Temple is especially fascinating and terrifying because of its sophisticated recruitment methods. Underground sanctuaries were built by the group hidden behind false walls and only accessible through secret passageways. To enter them, a member would have to take a ritual number of 22 steps, probably a reference to the 22 paths of the Tree of Life in Kabbalah. They created an entire alternate world, complete with hidden chambers, holographic displays and elaborate ceremonies that made members feel like they were part of something truly special and secret. The psychological techniques used by these cults are remarkably similar across cultures and time periods. They isolate members from outside influences. They create an us versus them mentality. They demand increasingly extreme demonstrations of loyalty, and they gradually normalize violence as a necessary tool for achieving their ultimate goals. In 1981, a young man named Vernon Howell, later known as David Koresh, came to Mount Carmel and studied biblical prophecy under Lois Roden. By 1983, Howell Koresh had gained a group of followers that separated from Lois' organization to form the Davidian branch, Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association. Koresh would go on to lead his followers into a deadly confrontation with federal agents that would claim nearly 100 lives, including dozens of children. What makes the branch Davidians particularly tragic is how a religious group that started with sincere beliefs about biblical prophecy devolved into something much darker. Koresh kept spiritual wives, some of whom were underage. The government also had eyes on the group because they believed Koresh was stockpiling weapons. The combination of religious extremism, weapons stockpiling, and child abuse created a powder keg that eventually exploded. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments provides perhaps the most horrifying example of failed prophecy leading to mass murder. The group did predict the end of the world for December 31st, 1999, later revising the date and claiming that on March 17, 2000, the Virgin Mary would appear and take members to heaven. The prophetic failure may have induced a number of members to doubt the leaders and ask for the return of money they had contributed. When faced with angry followers demanding their money back and questioning their authority, the leadership made a horrifying decision. Minutes after the members arrived at the party, nearby villagers heard an explosion and the building was gutted in an intense fire that killed all 530. In attendance, the windows and doors of the building had been boarded up to prevent people from leaving. They murdered their own followers rather than admit they had been wrong. But the horror didn't stop there. 4 days after the church fire, police investigated movement properties and discovered hundreds of bodies at sites across southern Uganda. 6 bodies were discovered sealed in the latrine of the Kanungu compound, as well as 153 bodies at a compound in Buhunaje, 155 bodies at Dominic Kataribabo's estate at Rugazi, where they had been poisoned and stabbed. The leaders had been systematically killing members for weeks, possibly months, before the final massacre. These cults didn't just destroy the lives of their immediate members. They left lasting scars on families, communities, and entire societies. The OTS was a major factor that led to the strengthening of the anti-cult movement in Europe. Particularly in Francophone Europe, governments around the world were forced to confront the reality that dangerous cults could emerge anywhere, targeting anyone and causing unprecedented levels of destruction. The sophistication of some of these groups is truly chilling. Aum Shinrikyo, for example, wasn't just a religious cult at the end of 1993. The cult started secretly manufacturing the nerve agent sarin, and later VX Aum tested its sarin on sheep at Banjawan Station, a remote pastoral property in Western Australia, killing 29 sheep. They were conducting chemical weapons tests in the Australian outback, while simultaneously running meditation centers and yoga classes in major cities. The dual nature of these organizations is what made them so dangerous on the surface. They appeared to offer spiritual enlightenment, personal growth, and community. Underneath, they were sophisticated criminal enterprises capable of murder, terrorism, and mass manipulation. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming for members trying to reconcile the peaceful teachings with the violent reality. What's perhaps most disturbing is how these cults were able to operate for years, or even decades, before their true nature was exposed. On the night of 27 June 1994, the cult carried out a chemical weapons attack against civilians when they released sarin in the central Japanese city of Matsumoto, Nagano, with the help of a converted refrigerator truck. Members of the cult released a cloud of sarin which floated near the homes of judges. They were literally testing chemical weapons on innocent civilians, and it took the authorities months to connect the attacks to the cult. The international implications of these cults cannot be understated. Groups like Aum Shinrikyo represented a new kind of threat. Non-state actors with apocalyptic beliefs and access to weapons of mass destruction. Aum Shinrikyo, which split into Aleph and Hikari. No-Wa in 2007 had already been formally designated a terrorist organization by several countries, including Russia, Canada, Japan, France, Kazakhstan, as well as the European Union. This was perhaps the first time a religious cult had achieved the status of an international terrorist organization. The human cost of these movements is staggering. We're talking about thousands of lives lost, families destroyed, children orphaned, and communities traumatized. At least 778 people died in total from the Ugandan movement alone. And that's just one group among dozens of similar organizations that emerged during the same period. The psychological aftermath for survivors is equally devastating. Imagine discovering that everything you believed about your spiritual community was a lie, that the leaders you trusted with your life and the lives of your children were actually predators and murderers. Many survivors report feeling profound guilt, shame, and confusion that can last for decades. What makes these cults particularly insidious is how they exploit genuine spiritual seeking. Many people join these groups with sincere desires for meaning, purpose, and connection. They're not necessarily naive or gullible. They're often intelligent, thoughtful individuals who happen to encounter a charismatic leader at a vulnerable moment in their lives. The recruitment techniques used by these cults are remarkably sophisticated. They often begin with seemingly innocent offerings, meditation classes, self-help seminars, spiritual retreats. The transition from legitimate spiritual practice to dangerous cult behavior is so gradual that members often don't realize what's happening until it's too late. The role of charismatic leadership in these movements cannot be overstated. Figures like David Koresh, Shoko Asahara, and Joseph DiMambro possessed an almost supernatural ability to inspire devotion and obedience. They combined genuine spiritual insight with masterful psychological manipulation, creating a toxic mixture that proved irresistible to many followers. These leaders often positioned themselves as divine or semi-divine figures, who alone possessed the keys to salvation, enlightenment, or survival. They claimed special relationships with God, direct communication with higher beings, or unique knowledge about the end times. This made questioning their authority not just difficult, but literally unthinkable for many followers. The economic exploitation involved in many of these cults adds another layer of tragedy. Members were often required to surrender their possessions, money, and even children to the group. This created a powerful form of control while simultaneously funding the leadership's increasingly grandiose and dangerous schemes. The international nature of many of these cults also highlights how globalization can facilitate the spread of dangerous ideologies. The Order of the Solar Temple had lodges across multiple countries, allowing the leadership to move money, people, and potentially weapons across international borders with relative ease. The technological sophistication of some groups is also remarkable. Aum Shinrikyo operated legitimate businesses, including computer companies and scientific research facilities. This provided both cover for their illegal activities and the technical expertise necessary to manufacture chemical weapons. The legacy of these cults continues to influence how we think about religious freedom, security, and the responsibility of governments to protect their citizens from dangerous groups. The challenge is balancing legitimate religious expression with the need to prevent tragedies like those we've discussed. Understanding these movements is crucial, not just for historical knowledge, but for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary groups. The techniques used by cult leaders haven't fundamentally changed, and the human vulnerabilities they exploit remain constant. The stories of these cults serve as powerful reminders of both the best and worst aspects of human nature. They show how our deepest needs for meaning, belonging, and transcendence can be twisted into instruments of destruction, but they also demonstrate the incredible resilience of survivors and the importance of maintaining critical thinking, even in the face of charismatic authority. As we move forward, it's essential to remember that the capacity for both great good and great evil exists within all of us. The difference often lies in the circumstances we encounter and the choices we make when faced with powerful but dangerous ideas. The history of these cults teaches us to be forever vigilant against those who would exploit our deepest human needs for their own dark purposes. These 33 examples represent just a fraction of the dangerous cults that have emerged throughout history, each one a reminder that the price of freedom, including religious freedom, is eternal vigilance, not just by governments, but by all of us as individuals and members of communities. Now let me move forward with the script continuation using the information I've gathered. But the real monsters weren't fictional. They were walking among us, recruiting followers and slowly turning them into killers. Let's continue our descent into the darkness that history keeps trying to forget. Heaven's Gate believed they could transcend human form by boarding a spaceship they thought was following the Hale-Bopp comet on March 26, 1997. Police discovered 39 bodies in a mansion near San Diego, the largest mass suicide on U.S. soil. But this wasn't just a group of random people making a desperate choice. These were intelligent, educated individuals, many with technical skills, who had even started their own web design business called Higher Source. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate reveals how sophisticated modern cults had become. Members were mostly in their 40s, baby boomers responsible for the PC revolution, who watched The X-Files and Star Trek religiously. They combined New Age spirituality with UFO beliefs and Christian theology, creating a toxic cocktail that proved irresistible to people searching for meaning in an increasingly digital world. The members killed themselves over 3 days using phenobarbital alcohol and hydrocodone, then put plastic bags over their heads and suffocated to death, after which they were covered in shrouds. They were all wearing identical black outfits and Nike sneakers, with exactly $5.75 in their pockets, a final bizarre uniformity that extended even to their deaths. But if Heaven's Gate represented the technological evolution of cults, then the Branch Davidians showed how traditional religious extremism could explode into violence when confronted by government authority. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, was the head of the Branch Davidians, who claimed to be its final prophet with apocalyptic biblical teachings, including interpretations of the Book of Revelation and the 7 Seals. Children in the compound were kept in line by wooden paddles and faced severe beatings for minor infractions, Like spilling a glass of milk, mothers, under Koresh's control, would beat their own children until they bled. Koresh didn't just control their bodies. He controlled their souls, claiming that God had chosen him to father children with multiple wives, including underage girls. Koresh claimed he needed multiple wives because it was his job to sire 24 children who would become elders and help rule after the kingdom of God's re-established. He announced that every woman of childbearing age, from 12 up, were now his wives and could have sex only with him for procreation purposes. Meanwhile, the actual husbands of these women were forbidden from having sex at all, supposedly so they could focus on studying the Bible. The Waco siege began on February 28, 1993, when federal agents raided the Branch Davidian compound at Mount Carmel Center Ranch, suspecting the group of stockpiling illegal weapons. What followed was a 51-day standoff that captivated the nation and ended in horror on April 19th. The siege ended when FBI agents carried out a tank and tear gas assault, which culminated in a massive fire. 76 Branch Davidians, including 20 children and 2 miscarried babies, died. The Waco tragedy demonstrates how cult leaders often engineer the very confrontations they claim to be defending against. Koresh had long preached about a final battle with government forces, and when that battle came, he chose to burn his followers alive rather than surrender the children who died in that fire. Never had a choice in Koresh's apocalyptic fantasies. But perhaps no cult leader has captured the American imagination quite like Charles Manson, whose followers committed some of the most shocking murders in criminal history. In 1969, Manson family members, Susan Atkins, Charles Watson, and Patricia Krenwinkel, entered the home of Hollywood actress Sharon Tate and murdered her and 4 others. The following night, members murdered supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary. Charles Manson led the Manson family, a cult based in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Some cult members committed at least 9 murders at 4 locations in July and August 1969. Manson never directly participated in the killings, but his psychological control over his followers was so complete that they killed on his command, believing they were starting a race war he called Helter Skelter. At Spahn Ranch, Manson exercised total domination over the group. Members were reportedly forbidden from wearing eyeglasses or carrying money and followers. Detailed long nights of lectures where Manson instructed others to take LSD and listen to him preach the combination of drugs, isolation, and psychological manipulation created perfect conditions for turning young, idealistic people into killers. What's truly disturbing about Manson is how he recruited his followers not from society's margins, but from middle-class families. Manson recruited a devoted set of followers to his family, some of whom went on to murder people for him, whose tragic story has inspired numerous books, films, and TV programs. These weren't hardened criminals. They were mostly young women seeking spiritual meaning, who found themselves trapped in a web of manipulation so complete they would kill for a man who offered them nothing but delusion. But Manson wasn't even the deadliest cult leader in American history. That distinction belongs to Jim Jones, whose People's Temple ended in the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. The Jonestown Massacre was a mass murder-suicide of the People's Temple cult in 1978, after cult members attacked Congressman Leo Ryan, who was investigating the cult. Jones enacted a suicide plan, giving a fruit drink laced with cyanide to children and adult members, killing more than 900 people. Jones commanded everyone to gather in the main pavilion and commit what he termed a revolutionary act. The youngest members were the first to die, as parents and nurses used syringes to drop a potent mix of cyanide sedatives and powdered fruit juice into children's throats. Imagine the horror of parents forced to poison their own children, believing until the very end that they were saving them from a world that Jones had convinced them was evil. The temple had received monthly half-pound shipments of cyanide since 1976, after Jones obtained a jeweler's license to buy the chemical, purportedly to clean gold in May 1978. A temple doctor wrote a memo asking permission to test cyanide on Jonestown's pigs, as their metabolism was close to human beings. Jones had been planning this massacre for years, methodically preparing to murder his own followers while maintaining the facade of a utopian community. Temple members worked long days in the fields and were subjected to harsh punishments. If they questioned Jones' authority, their passports were confiscated, their letters home censored, and members were encouraged to inform on one another. Jones created a prison disguised as paradise, where escape was impossible, and questioning his authority meant death. The psychological techniques these cult leaders used are remarkably similar. Whether we're talking about Jones, Manson, Koresh, or the leaders of Heaven's Gate, they all isolated their followers from outside influences, created us versus them mentalities, and gradually normalized violence as a tool for achieving their twisted goals. They preyed on fundamental human needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning, then slowly corrupted those needs into instruments of destruction. What makes these cults particularly tragic is how they attracted intelligent, thoughtful people who were genuinely seeking spiritual truth and community. These weren't gullible fools. These were doctors, lawyers, teachers, students, and professionals who happened to encounter charismatic psychopaths at vulnerable moments in their lives. The techniques these leaders used could work on anyone given the right circumstances and enough time. The international implications of these movements cannot be ignored. Groups like Aum Shinrikyo proved that cults could become terrorist organizations capable of weapons of mass destruction. The Order of the Solar Temple was a new religious movement, notorious for mass deaths throughout the 1990s. Many members of the OTs were wealthy and socially successful, often middle-aged professionals who were highly cultured. This drew from its approach elitist and interested in aesthetics, with a religious view that was non-fundamentalist. Underground sanctuaries were built by the group, hidden behind false walls, and only accessible through secret passageways. To enter them, a member would have to take a ritual number of 22 steps. The Solar Temple created elaborate theatrical experiences, complete with holographic displays and secret chambers that made members feel like they were part of something truly special and mystical. These groups didn't just destroy individual lives. They left lasting scars on families, communities, and entire societies. The children who survived these cults often struggled for decades with trauma, guilt, and the challenge of rebuilding their identities after being raised in environments where reality was constantly manipulated. The legacy of these cults continues to influence how we think about religious freedom, security, and the responsibility of governments to protect citizens from dangerous groups. The challenge remains balancing legitimate spiritual expression with preventing tragedies like Jonestown, Waco, and the countless other incidents where faith was weaponized against the faithful. Understanding these movements isn't just about historical knowledge. It's about recognizing that the human vulnerabilities these leaders exploited remain constant. The techniques of isolation, manipulation, and gradual indoctrination haven't changed, and neither has our fundamental need for meaning, belonging, and purpose. What these 33 examples reveal is that the capacity for both transcendent good and horrific evil exists within human nature. The difference often lies in the leaders we choose to follow and our willingness to maintain critical thinking even when faced with charismatic authority that promises simple answers to life's complex questions. The victims of these cults deserve to be remembered not as weak-minded fools, but as people who were systematically manipulated by master manipulators who understood human psychology better than their victims understood themselves. Their stories serve as eternal warnings about the price of surrendering our individual judgment to those who claim divine authority over our lives. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most dangerous cults weren't always the most obviously bizarre. They were often the ones that seemed most normal, most sophisticated, most appealing to educated, reasonable people. The lesson isn't that we should avoid all spiritual communities, but that we must remain vigilant against those who demand absolute obedience, claim exclusive access to truth, and gradually isolate us from the people and principles that keep us grounded. The history of these 33 cults teaches us that eternal vigilance is the price not just of freedom, but of sanity itself. In a world where charismatic leaders continue to prey on our deepest human needs, we must remember that no one person has all the answers, no matter how convincing they might seem, and that the moment we stop questioning is the moment we become vulnerable to those who would use our faith against us. Based on my research, I'll continue the script, focusing on additional dangerous cults that history has tried to forget or minimize. Here's the continuation. But the dark spiral of human madness doesn't end there. Meet the Rajneeshpuram cult, better known as the Rajneeshis, who didn't just challenge authority, they became America's first bioterrorists. In 1984, followers of the charismatic guru, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, launched the largest bioterror attack in United States history when they deliberately contaminated salad bars in the Dalles, Oregon, with salmonella bacteria. In 1984, 751 people suffered food poisoning in the Dalles, Oregon, United States, due to the deliberate contamination of salad bars at 10 local restaurants with salmonella. The incident was the first and largest bioterrorist attack in U.S. history. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated attempt to suppress voter turnout, so Rajneeshi candidates could win local elections. A group of prominent followers of Rajneesh, also known as Osho, led by Ma Anand Sheela, had hoped to incapacitate the voting population of the city so that their own candidates would win the 1984 Wasco County elections. The attack was methodical and chilling. The chosen biological agent was Salmonella enterica typhimurium, which was first delivered through glasses of water to 2 county commissioners, and then at salad bars and in salad dressing. But this was just a test run for something even more sinister. Authorities later discovered the cult had been planning to poison the entire water supply of the Dalles and had considered using HIV, the AIDS virus, as a biological weapon. Authorities found abundant evidence at the commune of not only S. enterica typhimurium, but a fairly sophisticated medical research laboratory, and evidence that the cult had considered employing other deadly pathogens, including HIV, the AIDS virus. They were operating what investigators described as a bacteriological freezer-dryer for large-scale production of microbes. Now let's travel to the heart of Africa and encounter the Blood Angels, a name that sounds like something from a horror movie, but describes one of history's most secretive and deadly cults operating in the Central African region. This isn't about supernatural beings, it's about very real human predators who used religious symbolism to justify unspeakable acts of violence. These Blood Angels weren't your typical cult. They were a network of family-based groups that practiced incest, abuse, and murder under the guise of maintaining pure bloodlines. A stern disciplinarian who in later years looked and dressed like a mortician. Ortel made incest a tenet of the clan's faith, informed by his work breeding Holstein cows on the Kingston's dairy farm in order to maintain his family's superior bloodlines. Ortel married and had children with 2 of his half-sisters and 2 nieces. But perhaps the most chilling cult from history's darker chapters was the Thuggee, a secret society of professional assassins who operated in India for over 6 centuries, from the 13th to 19th century. These weren't random killers, they were organized, ritualistic murderers who strangled their victims in the name of the Hindu goddess Kali. Eradicated by the British in the 1830s, organized gangs of professional assassins known as Thuggees would murder in the name of the Hindu goddess Kali. Thuggees, from the Sanskrit word meaning concealment, were an organized gang of professional assassins, sometimes described as the world's first mafia, who operated from the 13th to the 19th centuries in India. Members of the fanatical religious group, who were infamous for their ritualistic assassinations, carried out in the name of the Hindu goddess Kali, were known as thugs, a word that passed into the English language during the British occupation of India. The Thuggees' methods were as sophisticated as they were. Brutal Thuggees worked by joining groups of travelers and gaining their trust before surprising them in the night, and typically strangling them with a handkerchief or noose. By using this quick and quiet method, which left no blood and required no special weapons, the Thuggees would then rob their victim and bury them carefully. The scale of their operations was staggering. A band of 20 confessed that they had participated in 5,200 murders. An individual named Burham, who had been a strangler for 40 years, had the highest lifetime score to his discredit, 931. When asked if he felt any remorse, Burham coldly replied that no man should feel guilt for following his trade. But the Thuggee weren't just murderers. They were an entire shadow society with their own language, customs, and religious practices. The fraternity possessed a jargon of their own, known as Ramasi, as well as certain signs by which its members recognized each other in the most remote parts of India. They were also bound by a set of rules, such as the prohibition to steal a person's property without killing them, in accordance with ritual first. The cult's twisted code of ethics included specific rules about who could and couldn't be killed. Brahmins were not killed because of their purity. Killing of the sick was considered an unworthy sacrifice, and women were not killed because they were considered to be incarnations of Kali. Yet this moral flexibility often crumbled when secrecy was at stake. Membership was hereditary, passed down from father to son, creating generations of professional killers. Membership to the fraternity of Thuggees was often through hereditary lines passed down from father to son. Imagine growing up in a family where your career path was predetermined as murder and robbery, all in the name of religious devotion. Meanwhile, in America, the Death Angels were creating their own reign of terror during the 1970s. This wasn't a single cult, but a network of black nationalist groups who believed they could earn points towards salvation by killing white people. The zebra murders in San Francisco were just the tip of the iceberg. The zebra murders were a string of racially motivated murders and related attacks committed by a group of 4 black serial killers in San Francisco, California. United States, from October 1973 to April 1974, they killed at least 15 white people and wounded 8 others. Some authorities believe that the Death Angels, as the perpetrators called themselves, may have killed as many as 73 or more victims since 1970. Their methods were as random as they were terrifying. The pattern of killing is by random street shooting or hacking to death, with machete cleaver or knife decapitation or other forms of mayhem brings special credit from the organization for the killers they targeted: hitchhikers, pedestrians, anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Miami, another Death Angels group operated under Yahweh, Ben Yahweh, a charismatic leader who convinced his followers he was literally God Yahweh, Ben Yahweh, the founder and leader of the murderous nation of Yahweh, who called himself the Black God to join his inner circle. Called the Brotherhood, members had to prove their loyalty in the most horrific way possible. To get in the group, you had to bring back proof that you killed a white person. Amani said one day, a member walked into the temple and handed Yahweh Ben Yahweh an ear. Amani watched him toss the severed body part in his hand like a toy ball. Praise Yahweh, Yahweh, Ben Yahweh said approvingly. These weren't isolated incidents of violence. They were part of a systematic campaign of terror orchestrated by a man who had convinced his followers that murder was a religious duty. The FBI eventually arrested Yahweh, Ben Yahweh and his followers, charging them with 18 charges of racketeering, including 14 killings, extortion, and arson. But perhaps no cult demonstrates the danger of charismatic leadership quite like the Vampire Clan, led by Rod Ferrell. In 1996, this teenage cult leader convinced his followers they were vampires, and that murder was part of their dark calling. Roderick Justin, Rod Ferrell, born March 28, 1980, is an American murderer and cult leader. Ferrell claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire named Visago, a character he created for himself after becoming obsessed with the role-playing game, Vampire the Masquerade. In 1998, Ferrell pleaded guilty to the double slaying of a couple from Eustis, Florida, becoming the youngest person in Florida on death row at that time. Ferrell and his followers didn't just play at being vampires. They committed very real murders before Richard awakened. Ferrell beat him multiple times with it, fracturing both his skull and ribs almost instantly, knocking him out, and killing him shortly thereafter, when Ruth found Ferrell and Anderson in the home. Moments later, Ferrell bludgeoned her to death, bashing her head with the crowbar. The psychological manipulation involved in these cults is absolutely staggering. They prey on fundamental human vulnerabilities. The need for belonging, purpose, meaning, and identity. They provide meaning, purpose, and belonging. Says Josh Hart, a professor of psychology at Union College who studies personality and social psychology, worldviews and belief systems. They offer a clear, confident vision and assert the superiority of the group as to the leaders themselves. They typically present themselves as infallible, confident, and grandiose. Their charisma draws people in, Hart says, and followers who are craving peace, belonging, and security might gain a sense of those things as well as confidence through participation in the group. Research shows that powerful cult leaders are highly adept at using psychological manipulation to control followers. Cult members typically don't realize they are being brainwashed. The indoctrination process is gradual and insidious. The indoctrination process can be key to a cult's success and leave a powerful impression on its victims. While each cult may be different, experts say that the methods to pull members in and keep them there resemble a similar playbook of psychological principles. One of the most powerful tools in a cult leader's arsenal is cognitive dissonance. One element is cognitive dissonance. The theory introduced in the late 1950s suggests that when people are confronted with facts that contradict their beliefs, values, and ideas, they will feel psychological discomfort, likely followed by the need to resolve that contradiction and reduce their uneasiness in a cult setting. Cognitive dissonance often keeps you trapped, as each compromise makes it more painful to admit you've been deceived. The recruitment tactics are remarkably similar across cultures and time periods. Cults recruit new members anywhere you might expect to meet new people. Social media, discussion groups, community clubs, events, and the like. These are typically non-threatening public situations that would not cause anyone to be suspicious. Cult recruiters get to know as much as they can about people and identify individuals who may be receptive to meeting a group of the recruiter's friends at dinner or another social event. Though the chosen targets are generally unaware, these seemingly innocent gestures are the first steps to being drawn into a cult. They target the vulnerable, those experiencing life transitions or personal crises. Receptive people are those who are looking to escape something such as an unhappy life situation and to belong, be accepted, and find meaning. Cults prey upon the vulnerable among us, such as teenage runaways, drug addicts, abuse survivors, those who have lost someone close to them through death or a breakup. those suffering from insecurity or mental health issues, or anyone who feels disconnected from society. The transformation from normal person to willing participant in violence doesn't happen overnight. Undue influence does not erase the person's old identity, but rather creates a new identity to suppress the old one. After different types of manipulation, the creation of a new identity is done step by formal indoctrination sessions, and informally by members, videos, games, movies, publications, and social digital media. What makes these cults particularly dangerous is how they gradually normalize violence and extreme behavior as they indoctrinate new members. Many cults separate them from their families, friends, and jobs, slowly remaking their identities to suit the group. They may force recruits to surrender their money, belongings, and bodies to the cult's leader and other members. They may use punishment, deprivation, and other tactics to wear them down. These efforts, which sometimes include threats, make new members dependent on and afraid to leave the group. Fully indoctrinated members often engage in behavior they never would have considered in their former lives. The international scope of these dangerous cults cannot be ignored. They represent a global phenomenon that transcends cultural, religious, and national boundaries, from the Thuggee in India to the Rajneeshis in America, from the Death Angels in California to the blood cults in Africa. These groups demonstrate humanity's capacity for both transcendent faith and horrific evil. The legacy of these cults continues to influence how governments and societies approach religious freedom, security, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. Cults, thousands of which exist in the United States, present a societal problem due to their ability to rob followers of free will, sever familial ties, and even incite violence, such as the case of the Manson family. The study may contribute to positive social change by improving experts' understanding of how cult leaders work, which could enable experts to devise interventions to help potential cult followers and their families. Understanding these movements isn't just about historical knowledge, it's about recognizing that the techniques used by cult leaders haven't fundamentally changed. The human vulnerabilities they exploit remain constant, and the capacity for both great good and great evil exists within all of us. The stories of these 33 cults serve as powerful warnings about the price of surrendering our critical thinking to charismatic authority figures who promise simple answers to life's complex questions. They remind us that eternal vigilance isn't just the price of freedom, it's the price of sanity itself in a world where those who would exploit our deepest human needs continue to walk among us. As we've seen throughout this dark journey, the most dangerous cults weren't always the most obviously bizarre. They were often the ones that seemed most normal, most appealing to educated, reasonable people. The lesson isn't that we should avoid all spiritual communities, but that we must remain vigilant against those who demand absolute obedience, claim exclusive access to truth, and gradually isolate us from the people and principles that keep us grounded. These 33 examples represent just a fraction of the dangerous cults that have emerged throughout history, each one a reminder that the capacity for both transcendent good and horrific evil exists within human nature, and that the difference often lies in the leaders we choose to follow and our willingness to maintain our individual judgment, even when faced with the most compelling promises of salvation, transformation, or belonging. Remember that no one person has all the answers, no matter how convincing they might seem, and that the moment we stop questioning is the moment we become vulnerable to those who would use our faith, hope, and deepest human needs against us. The road to complete mental enslavement rarely starts with the shocking ritual or the dramatic ceremony. These leaders understand that true control comes from rewriting reality, one small compromise at a time. The path to psychological domination is so gradual, so carefully calibrated that victims often don't realize they're trapped until it's far too late. But here's what makes these stories even more chilling. The techniques used by history's most dangerous cult leaders remain virtually unchanged. They prey on universal human vulnerabilities that exist in all of us: the need for belonging, purpose, meaning, and hope. These psychological manipulation methods are so effective, they could work on anyone given the right circumstances and enough time. Hassan defines mind control as a system that disrupts an individual's healthy identity development. Identities are composed of beliefs, behavior, thoughts, and patterns of emotions. When cults indoctrinate a member, they replace this authentic identity with an artificial one. This isn't science fiction. This is documented psychological warfare being waged against the human mind. The true masters of psychological manipulation, like Jeffrey Lundgren, understood something terrifying about human nature. Jeffrey Don Lundgren was an American self-proclaimed prophet, cult leader, and mass murderer who, on April 17, 1989, killed a family of 5 in Kirtland, Ohio. Lundgren led a Latter-day Saint movement-based cult and interpreted scripture using an unconventional method that he described as chiastic, which involved searching text for recurring patterns. He and several of his followers murdered the Avery family, fellow members of his cult, for which he was convicted and sentenced to death. Lundgren didn't start by murdering families. He started by offering spiritual guidance to members of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. While Lundgren was living at the farmhouse, he began to practice methods which were consistent with Robert Lifton's criteria for mind control. For example, cult members were forbidden to talk amongst themselves. Doing so was a sin called murmuring. Lundgren would eavesdrop on cult members to cause them to believe that he could read their minds. Imagine that level of psychological control, where speaking to your fellow members about your doubts becomes a sin, where the leader has somehow convinced you he can read your thoughts. This is mind control at its most sophisticated, not the crude brainwashing of movie villains, but subtle, systematic destruction of individual judgment. But Lundgren's story gets even more horrifying because it shows how cult leaders manufacture their own justifications for violence. Although the Averys were among his followers and had given or signed over to him tens of thousands of dollars, Lundgren had determined that Dennis Avery in particular was threatening his hold over the other cult members and thus had to be sacrificed. The Avery family weren't enemies. They were devoted followers who had given Lundgren their life savings. They had children ages 7, 13, and 15, but in Lundgren's twisted logic, their loyalty wasn't enough. In January 1990, paramilitary religious cult leader Jeffrey Lundgren and 12 of his followers were indicted in Lake County Common Police Court in connection with the execution-style murders in April 1989 of Dennis Avery, his wife Cheryl, and their daughters Trina, Rebecca, and Karen. Jeffrey Lundgren was found guilty on 5 counts of aggravated murder in August 1990 and received the death sentence. What's particularly chilling about Lundgren is how he convinced other cult members to participate in the murders. These weren't hardened criminals. These were people seeking spiritual meaning who had been so thoroughly manipulated they helped execute a family, including 3 children. The psychological techniques Lundgren used to achieve this level of control represent some of the darkest applications of human psychology. The techniques of brainwashing typically involve isolation from former associates and sources of information, an exacting regimen requiring absolute obedience and humility, strong social pressures and rewards for cooperation, physical and psychological punishments for non-cooperation ranging from social ostracism and criticism, deprivation of food, sleep and social contacts, to bondage and torture, and continual reinforcement. These aren't abstract concepts. These are the exact methods used by cult leaders across history and continents. The playbook is so consistent it's almost like there's a manual being passed down from one psychopath to the next. But perhaps no group in recent history demonstrates the global reach of cult manipulation quite like Aum Shinrikyo, a Japanese new religious movement and doomsday cult founded by Shoko Asahara in 1987. It carried out the deadly Tokyo subway sarin attack in 1995 and was found to have been responsible for the Matsumoto sarin attack the previous year. Asahara didn't just target the uneducated or desperate. At the end of 1993, the cult started secretly manufacturing the nerve agent sarin and, later, VX. Aum tested its sarin on sheep at Banjawan Station, a remote pastoral property in Western Australia, killing 29 sheep. This group included scientists, chemists, and highly educated professionals who were manufacturing weapons of mass destruction in secret laboratories while maintaining the facade of a religious organization. The sophistication of Aum Shinrikyo's operations was staggering. On the night of 27th June 1994, the cult carried out a chemical weapons attack against civilians when they released sarin in the central Japanese city of Matsumoto, Nagano. With the help of a converted refrigerator truck, members of the cult released a cloud of sarin which floated near the homes of judges who were overseeing a lawsuit concerning a real estate dispute, which was predicted to go against the cult. This Matsumoto incident killed 8 and harmed 500 more. Imagine the level of indoctrination required to convince educated professionals to participate in mass murder using chemical weapons. These weren't sudden crimes of passion. These were carefully planned terrorist attacks designed to kill innocent civilians, including targeting judges who were simply doing their jobs. The Tokyo subway attack that followed was even more horrific. A nerve agent sarin was released onto train cars, killing 12 and causing an estimated 6,000 people to seek medical attention, according to the U.S. State Department 2010 country report. The 1995 attack was the most serious terrorist attack in Japan's modern history, causing massive disruption and widespread fear in a society that is virtually free of crime. But here's what makes Aum Shinrikyo particularly terrifying. From a psychological perspective, the cult members genuinely believed they were saving humanity. After reviewing the history of the Japanese terrorist cult, Aum Shinrikyo, and its founder Chizuo Matsumoto, this article describes its terrorist attacks, which included the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system that killed 12 and injured 5,500. The impetus for the cult was its founder's religious fervor, which emerged in 1986 as an eclectic mix of Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, and Christian beliefs. Asahara had convinced his followers that by killing innocent people, they were actually performing acts of mercy, preventing these souls from accumulating bad karma in future lives. This is psychological manipulation at its most sophisticated, taking universal human desires to help others and twisting them into justifications for mass murder. The recruitment and indoctrination methods used by these cult leaders follow remarkably similar patterns, regardless of culture, religion, or time period. The reason that people often join doomsday cults in the first place is due to a manipulative trick known as a love bomb. This is when a cult, from the leaders down to the newest recruits, showers someone with affection, care, and support. Not only is this intended to make people feel welcome and at home, but it subtly and insidiously establishes a dependency relationship. Everything you need or want has to come through the cult. The love bombing technique is particularly insidious because it exploits our fundamental human need for connection and acceptance, but it's just the first step in a carefully orchestrated process of psychological control. After a while, it's given with a few conditions attached. In the end, affection and love are given only to those who behave exactly as they are supposed to. This creates a psychological dependency where victims become desperate to maintain the approval and affection they've become addicted to. Questioning the leader or the group's beliefs becomes literally unthinkable, because it threatens the only source of love and acceptance they have left. One of the key tactics of cult leaders is to isolate their followers from outside influences. This can take the form of physical separation, such as when members are required to live in communes, or emotional separation, such as when members are discouraged from speaking to friends and family outside the group. Jim Jones and the People's Temple required members to move to their commune in Guyana, while Shoko Asahara and Aum Shinrikyo encouraged members to quit their jobs and cut ties with their families. Isolation isn't just about physical location, it's about cutting off all sources of alternative information and perspectives. When cult members lose contact with family, friends, and independent sources of information, they become completely dependent on the cult for their understanding of reality. This makes them incredibly vulnerable to further manipulation and control. The psychological techniques these leaders use are so effective because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology. For a totalist system to wield complete control, the leader must tap fear. This is the fourth element of totalism. The process of brainwashing that totalist systems engage in is one of psychological, coercive manipulation, where the leader or group alternates terror with love. This creates what psychologists call trauma bonding, where victims become emotionally attached to their abusers. The constant alternation between love and fear creates a psychological dependency that's incredibly difficult to break, even when victims logically understand they're being manipulated. What makes these techniques particularly dangerous is how they can be applied by anyone with sufficient knowledge and lack of conscience. Brainwashing is an outdated psychological concept, but narcissistic cult leaders can still exercise extreme influence over smart, sane, regular people. But just because cultic experts no longer think in terms of brainwashing and deprogramming, doesn't mean that regular people aren't still in danger of being manipulated by bad actors and dark psychology forces. The only way to protect yourself is to stay informed about these mind control techniques so you'll be able to recognize them in the wild. The victims of these cults weren't weak-minded or gullible. They were often intelligent, educated people who happened to encounter skilled manipulators at vulnerable moments in their lives. Certain personality traits don't make you more vulnerable to cults, but situational factors like loneliness and uncertainty can increase your recruitment risk. Understanding the psychological manipulation techniques used by cult leaders isn't just about historical knowledge. It's about recognizing that these same vulnerabilities exist in all of us. The techniques of isolation, love bombing, fear manipulation, and gradual escalation of commitment can be used in many contexts, not just religious cults. The legacy of groups like Aum Shinrikyo and the Lundgren cult continues to influence how governments and law enforcement approach the threat of dangerous cults. Aum Shinrikyo, which split into Aleph and Hikari no Wa in 2007, had already been formally designated a terrorist organization by several countries, including Russia, Canada, Japan, France, Kazakhstan, as well as the European Union. These cases proved that cults could become sophisticated terrorist organizations capable of developing and deploying weapons of mass destruction. They showed that the traditional boundaries between religious movements and national security threats had become dangerously blurred. The human cost of these psychological manipulation techniques cannot be overstated. We're not just talking about people who joined unusual religious groups. We're talking about systematic psychological abuse that destroyed families, communities, and individual lives. The survivors of these cults often struggle for years or decades to rebuild their sense of self and their ability to trust their own judgment. What's perhaps most chilling about studying these cult leaders is realizing how ordinary they often appeared to outsiders. Lundgren was a lay minister. Asahara started as a yoga instructor. Many of these figures were charismatic, articulate, and appeared to be offering genuine spiritual guidance. The transformation from spiritual teacher to mass murderer often happened so gradually that even close followers didn't recognize the danger until it was too late. The psychological techniques we've explored represent some of the darkest applications of human psychology, but understanding them is crucial for protecting ourselves and others from similar manipulation. These aren't historical curiosities. These are ongoing threats that continue to exist in various forms throughout our society. The victims of these cults deserve to be remembered not as weak-minded fools, but as people who were systematically manipulated by expert practitioners of psychological control. Their stories serve as warnings about the importance of maintaining critical thinking, questioning authority, and staying connected to people and principles that keep us grounded in reality. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most dangerous aspect of cult psychology isn't the dramatic rituals or bizarre beliefs. It's the gradual, systematic erosion of individual judgment and autonomy. The moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our critical thinking to charismatic authority figures, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that destroyed so many lives throughout history. Now I'll continue the script for part 5 of the 33 Wildest Cults History Tried to Erase video. The psychological manipulation techniques these leaders used were so sophisticated they could turn normal people into willing killers. Let me tell you about Charles Manson and the Tate murders, because if you think you understand evil, you're about to discover a whole new level of darkness. In 1969, Charles Manson orchestrated a killing spree that would shock the world when his followers murdered actress Sharon Tate and 6 others in a series of brutal attacks. But here's what makes the Manson family particularly terrifying. Most of Manson's followers weren't hardened criminals, they were young women from middle-class backgrounds. Many attracted by the hippie counterculture, who were gradually radicalized by Manson's psychological manipulation. Manson created a doomsday cult built around his twisted vision of an apocalyptic race war he called Helter Skelter, convincing his white supremacist followers that black people would rise up and kill all whites except for Manson and his family, who would then rule over the survivors. Imagine being so completely brainwashed that you believe murdering innocent people will make you the ruler of a post-apocalyptic world. The psychological control Manson exercised was absolute when he ordered followers to kill everyone at Sharon Tate's house. His followers obeyed without question, carrying out the murders with shocking brutality. They killed 5 people, including the 8.5 months pregnant Sharon Tate, then wrote "Pig" with Tate's blood on the front door. These weren't professional killers. They were young people who had been so systematically manipulated they believed murder was a righteous act. But Manson's crimes were part of a much larger pattern of cult violence that was erupting around the world in the 2000s, because sometimes religious prophecy doesn't just fail, it explodes into mass murder. In Uganda, the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God became linked to over 900 deaths, creating an even larger toll than the Jonestown massacre, when their predicted apocalypse failed to materialize on schedule. The leadership made a horrifying decision. They would manufacture their own doomsday. In southwestern Uganda's Kanungu district in 2000, some 700 members of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments burned to death. But the horror didn't stop there. Investigators discovered this wasn't a mass suicide. It was systematic murder. The leaders had been killing members for weeks before the final massacre, because followers had started questioning their authority and demanding their money back. The church building where the final massacre occurred had been deliberately prepared for murder. Over 400 bodies were found in Shakahola Forest near Malindi, Kenya, in 2023, after rescued survivors stated they had been ordered to starve themselves to death by cult leader Paul Nthenge Mackenzie. Wait, that's actually a different, more recent cult massacre, but it shows this pattern of religious extremism turning deadly continues to this day. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a very different kind of religious persecution was unfolding, one that would affect millions of people and reveal how governments themselves can become cult-like in their fanaticism. The persecution of Falun Gong began in 1999, when the Chinese Communist Party launched a campaign to eliminate this new religious movement, characterized by propaganda, forced ideological conversion, and reportedly torture, sometimes resulting in death. But here's what makes the Falun Gong situation so disturbing. Practitioners are known for espousing truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, while focusing on meditation and Qigong exercises. This wasn't a violent doomsday cult. This was a peaceful spiritual movement that the state decided posed a threat. The Chinese government labeled Falun Gong an evil cult and created an extra-constitutional body called the 610 Office, specifically to lead the persecution. Falun Gong practitioners across China are subject to widespread surveillance, arbitrary detention, imprisonment, and torture, and they are at high risk of extrajudicial execution. The irony is staggering. A government calling a peaceful meditation practice a cult, while using cult-like tactics of absolute control and violent suppression. The centerpiece of the government's propaganda campaign was a self-immolation on Tiananmen Square, allegedly committed by Falun Gong practitioners. However, investigations found the individuals were not actually practitioners, and the episode was apparently an elaborate ploy to demonize the group, leading more Chinese citizens to view them as dangerous. The state literally staged fake evidence to justify persecution. But sometimes the most dangerous cults aren't the ones that isolate themselves in compounds. They're the ones that operate in plain sight, infiltrating communities and turning neighbors into killers. Let me tell you about Aum Shinrikyo, the doomsday cult that became the world's first terrorist organization to deploy chemical weapons. Aum Shinrikyo was behind a notorious attack in Japan in 1995, when members released toxic sarin gas into Tokyo's subway network, killing 13 people and sickening thousands. But here's what makes Aum Shinrikyo particularly terrifying. They weren't just a religious cult, they were a sophisticated criminal enterprise, operating legitimate businesses while secretly manufacturing weapons of mass destruction. At the cult's headquarters near Mount Fuji, authorities found a plant capable of producing enough sarin to kill millions. Imagine that level of preparation. They weren't planning a single terrorist attack. They were preparing for biological warfare on a massive scale, all while maintaining the facade of a legitimate religious organization. The sophistication of their operations was staggering. They had scientists, chemists, and highly educated professionals working to develop chemical weapons while simultaneously running meditation centers and yoga classes. This dual nature made them incredibly dangerous because nobody suspected that a religious group could simultaneously be planning genocide. What's perhaps most chilling about these cases is how they demonstrate that the techniques of psychological manipulation remain remarkably consistent across cultures and time periods. Whether we're talking about Manson in California, Uganda in Africa, China's persecution of Falun Gong, or Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, the playbook is always the same. First, they isolate their targets from outside influences, cutting off contact with family, friends, and independent sources of information. Then they create an us versus them mentality, where the outside world becomes the enemy, and only the group provides safety and truth. Next, they gradually normalize extreme behavior through incremental escalation. What starts as harmless spiritual practices slowly evolves into something much darker as members become more invested and more dependent on the group for their identity and purpose. Finally, they exploit fundamental human vulnerabilities, our need for meaning. Belonging, purpose, and hope in an uncertain world, they offer simple answers to complex questions, then slowly twist those answers into justifications for the unthinkable. The human cost of these psychological manipulation techniques cannot be overstated. We're talking about thousands of lives lost, families destroyed, children orphaned, and communities traumatized. The survivors often struggle for years or decades to rebuild their sense of self and their ability to trust their own judgment. What makes these stories particularly tragic is how they attracted intelligent, thoughtful people who were genuinely seeking spiritual truth and community. These weren't weak-minded fools. These were doctors, lawyers, teachers, students, and professionals who happened to encounter master manipulators at vulnerable moments in their lives. The international implications of these movements continue to influence how governments and societies approach religious freedom, security, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The challenge remains balancing legitimate spiritual expression with preventing tragedies like we've discussed. Understanding these movements isn't just about historical knowledge. It's about recognizing that the human vulnerabilities these leaders exploited remain constant. The techniques of isolation, manipulation, and gradual indoctrination haven't changed fundamentally, and neither has our need for meaning, belonging, and purpose. What these examples reveal is that the capacity for both transcendent good and horrific evil exists within human nature. The difference often lies in the leaders we choose to follow and our willingness to maintain critical thinking, even when faced with charismatic authority figures who promise simple solutions to life's complex problems. The victims of these cults deserve to be remembered not as gullible followers, but as people who were systematically manipulated by expert practitioners of psychological control. Their stories serve as eternal warnings about the price of surrendering our individual judgment to those who claim divine or special authority over our lives. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most dangerous cults weren't always the most obviously bizarre. They were often the ones that seemed most normal, most appealing to educated, reasonable people. The lesson isn't that we should avoid all spiritual communities, but that we must remain vigilant against those who demand absolute obedience, claim exclusive access to truth, and gradually isolate us from the people and principles that keep us grounded in reality. These movements prove that eternal vigilance isn't just the price of political freedom, it's the price of psychological freedom as well. In a world where charismatic leaders continue to prey on our deepest human needs, we must remember that no one person has all the answers, no matter how convincing they might seem. The moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our critical thinking to someone who promises to solve all our problems, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that destroyed so many lives throughout history. The techniques may evolve, but the fundamental patterns remain the same: isolation, manipulation, escalation, and ultimately the exploitation of our deepest human needs for the darkest possible purposes. But there's something even more disturbing about the cults we've discussed so far, because while groups like the Manson family and Aum Shinrikyo eventually revealed their true nature through spectacular acts of violence, there are other cults that operated for decades in the shadows, slowly destroying lives while maintaining perfect facades of respectability and normalcy. These are the cults that didn't make headlines with dramatic mass murders, but instead perfected the art of gradual psychological destruction, leaving survivors with trauma that can last a lifetime. While the perpetrators often escaped justice entirely, they understood that the most effective evil is often the kind that flies completely under the radar. Which brings us to the truly horrifying realization that for every cult we know about that made international headlines, there are likely dozens or even hundreds more that operated in complete secrecy, using the same psychological techniques, but with enough sophistication to avoid detection. The history of these 33 cults teaches us that the greatest threat isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who never reveal their true nature until it's far too late. And by then, the damage has already been done. Not just to individuals, but to entire communities, and sometimes even to society itself. But wait, there's something even more terrifying about the manipulation techniques we've discussed so far, because at least those groups eventually revealed their true nature through spectacular acts of violence. But there are other cults that operated for decades in the shadows, perfecting the art of slow psychological destruction without ever making headlines. These hidden predators understood that the most effective evil isn't the kind that explodes in dramatic massacres. It's the kind that destroys lives so gradually, so systematically, that by the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's already far too late. And the damage has been done not just to individuals, but to entire families and communities. Take the Rajneeshpuram cult, better known as the Rajneeshis, who didn't just challenge religious norms. They became America's first bioterrorists in 1984. 751 people suffered food poisoning in the Dalles, Oregon, United States, due to the deliberate contamination of salad bars at 10 local restaurants with salmonella. But here's what makes this attack particularly terrifying. It wasn't random violence. It was a calculated attempt to suppress voter turnout, so Rajneeshi candidates could win local elections. A group of prominent followers of Rajneesh, also known as Osho, led by May Ann and Sheila, had hoped to incapacitate the voting population of the city so that their own candidates would win the 1984 Wasco County elections. Imagine that level of cynical manipulation. They weren't just trying to control their followers. They were trying to control democracy itself through biological warfare. The sophistication of their operation was staggering. Skeels described the scene at the Rajneesh laboratory as a bacteriological freezer dryer for large-scale production of microbes, and an invoice dated September 25, 1984 from the American Type Culture collection of microbes was discovered showing an order received by the Rajneeshpuram laboratory for Salmonella typhi, the bacterium that causes the life-threatening illness, typhoid fever. They weren't just planning one attack, they were preparing for biological warfare on a massive scale, while maintaining the facade of a peaceful religious community. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming for members trying to reconcile meditation and spiritual growth with plans to poison entire water supplies. But perhaps no group demonstrates the intersection of race cult psychology and systematic violence, quite like the Death Angels, the perpetrators of San Francisco's zebra murders. The zebra murders were a string of racially motivated murders and related attacks committed by a group of 4 black serial killers in San Francisco, California, United States. From October 1973 to April 1974, they killed at least 15 white people and wounded 8 others. Some authorities believe that the Death Angels, as the perpetrators called themselves, may have killed as many as 73 or more victims since 1970. What made the Death Angels particularly chilling was their systematic approach to earning their deadly credentials. Each member who killed 4 white children, 5 white women, or 9 white men was awarded with wings that certified his angel status. That meant a photograph of the member was taken, and 2 wings were drawn at the neck in black ballpoint. The pattern of killing is by random street shooting or hacking to death with machete cleaver or knife decapitation or other forms of mayhem. Bring special credit from the organization for the killers. They turned murder into a point system. a grotesque game where human lives were reduced to scores on a demonic leaderboard. The psychological techniques used by these cults follow remarkably similar patterns regardless of their stated ideology or methods. They isolate members from outside influences. They create us versus them mentalities. They gradually normalize extreme behavior, and they exploit fundamental human needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning. What's particularly disturbing is how these groups attracted intelligent, educated people who were genuinely seeking something meaningful. The Rajneeshis included wealthy professionals, the Death Angels recruited from urban communities, seeking empowerment and identity. These weren't desperate people on society's margins. These were individuals who happened to encounter master manipulators at vulnerable moments in their lives. The international implications of these movements cannot be understated. They proved that cults could become terrorist organizations capable of sophisticated attacks on civilian populations. They showed that the traditional boundaries between religious movements and national security threats had become dangerously blurred. The human cost extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families were destroyed, communities were traumatized, and entire societies were forced to confront the reality that dangerous extremists could emerge anywhere, targeting anyone and causing unprecedented levels of destruction. What makes studying these groups particularly important is recognizing that the techniques they used remain virtually unchanged. The same psychological vulnerabilities they exploited exist in all of us. The capacity for both transcendent good and horrific evil lies within human nature, and the difference often comes down to the leaders we encounter and our willingness to maintain critical thinking even when faced with charismatic authority. The legacy of these cults continues to influence how we think about religious freedom, security, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The challenge remains balancing legitimate spiritual expression with preventing tragedies while understanding that eternal vigilance isn't just the price of political freedom, it's the price of psychological freedom as well. These movements serve as powerful warnings about what happens when our deepest human needs for meaning, belonging, and transcendence are weaponized against us by those who understand human psychology better than their victims understand themselves. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're ongoing reminders that the moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our individual judgment to someone who promises simple answers to life's complex questions, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that have destroyed so many lives throughout history. The techniques may evolve, but the fundamental patterns remain the same: isolation, manipulation, gradual escalation, and ultimately the exploitation of our deepest human needs for the darkest possible purposes. Understanding these patterns isn't just about historical knowledge, it's about protecting ourselves and others from similar manipulation, in whatever forms it may take in our own time. The shadow of Mount Carmel Center, near Waco, Texas. One name continues to haunt the American consciousness: David Koresh, the enigmatic leader whose manipulation techniques turned a religious community into a powder keg that would ultimately claim nearly 100 lives, including dozens of children. But Koresh's story isn't just about one deranged individual. It's about the terrifying power of psychological control and how ordinary people can be gradually transformed into willing participants in their own destruction. David Koresh was born Vernon Wayne Howell on August 17, 1959, in Houston, Texas, to unmarried parents, 20-year-old Bobby Wayne Howell and 14-year-old Bonnie Sue Clark. 2 years after the birth, the relationship broke down. Bonnie continued to flounder with an abusive first marriage to a Joe Golden, quickly ending in divorce after this around 1962. Unable to cope with her situation, Bonnie moved away to Dallas. The man who would become one of America's most notorious cult leaders started life abandoned by his parents and raised by his grandparents, in a cycle of neglect and abuse that would shape his future manipulation of others. He never knew his father and was raised by his grandparents. He described his childhood as lonely and indicated that he suffered abuse at the hands of his stepfather. He also dropped out of high school. This traumatic foundation would prove crucial in understanding how Koresh later weaponized suffering and isolation to control his followers. In 1981, a young man named Vernon Howell, later known as David Koresh, came to Mount Carmel. Koresh got involved with the Branch Davidians when he was 22 years old, and soon became embroiled in an affair with the group's president Lois Roden, who was then in her 60s. He reportedly told her he was destined to father a child with her. He tried to seize control of the group after Lois passed away. He literally fought her son, George Roden, for control. From the beginning, Koresh demonstrated the manipulative charm that would define his leadership. He didn't just join the Branch Davidians, he systematically positioned himself to take control through a calculated relationship with an older, vulnerable woman. By 1983, Koresh had joined a religious sect that called themselves the Branch Davidians, Branch Davidian, a splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, founded by former Seventh-day Adventist Victor Houteff. In 1934, Koresh fell under the tutelage of Lois Roden, who took over leadership along with her husband Benjamin Roden from Houteff after his death in 1955. But what made Koresh particularly dangerous wasn't his religious knowledge. It was his understanding of human psychology and his ability to gradually reshape reality for his followers. One of the things about being a Branch Davidian was, you're supposed to separate yourself from the world. Bunz said the world is the sins, the flesh, the desires of the world, and you're supposed to be spiritual. Former followers said the compound had no running water heat or electricity, and there was Bible study 3 times a day. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was the first step in a sophisticated system of psychological control that would strip away his followers' connections to the outside world, leaving them completely dependent on Koresh for their understanding of reality. Viger said Koresh constantly told them the end of the world was coming. They were the chosen people to survive because David was the son of God. She said they were taught to prepare for war, and that the end times as predicted in the book of Revelation were near. Koresh's manipulation techniques went far beyond religious indoctrination. He systematically broke down normal social and sexual boundaries, claiming divine authority over every aspect of his followers' lives, because several of Koresh's spiritual wives were teenagers. The community was accused of child abuse by a former member and an anti-cult activist. Those allegations were aired in a 1992 trial, in which an ex-member sought custody of his daughter, coupled with Koresh's launching of a retail gun business. Those child abuse charges began to attract the attention of legal authorities. The psychological control Koresh exercised over children was particularly horrific. Dana Okimoto, who gave birth to his son, Sky. Okimoto told ABC News in a 2003 interview that children were kept in line by a wooden paddle and faced severe beatings for minor infractions, like spilling a glass of milk. She said she remembered being so under Koresh's control that she beat Sky until he bled. If there was one thing I could take back, I would take back the spankings, Dana Okimoto said at the time. This level of control didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of systematic psychological manipulation that gradually normalized violence and abuse. Bruce Perry, the chief of psychiatry at Texas Children's Hospital, who led the team that cared for the 21 children that survived the siege of the Davidian compound, reported that the children were likely exposed to inappropriate concepts of sexuality and subject to a whole variety of destructive emotional techniques, including shame, coercion, fear, intimidation, humiliation, guilt, overt aggression, and power. Koresh's manipulation extended beyond individual followers to the entire structure of the community branch. Davidian Clive Doyle said Koresh had been interested in music, and Lois Roden encouraged him to continue sing and play guitar, which became part of the group's daily Bible study sessions. He believed he was King David Doyle, told ABC News he was using music to reach a lot of people. We're thinking maybe it's a stage name, but it was more than that. Music became another tool of control, creating emotional bonds and shared experiences that reinforced Koresh's authority while simultaneously isolating followers from outside cultural influences. The name change from Vernon Howell to David Koresh wasn't just theatrical, it was psychological warfare, designed to erase his past identity and create a mythical figure that followers couldn't question. In his new book, Waco David Koresh, The Branch Davidians and a Legacy of Rage, author Jeff Gwynne describes the group's leader David Koresh as a religious demagogue who took multiple teenage brides and preached that he and his followers would bring about a conflict that would make the end of days happen. In their lifetimes, David Koresh wanted to make sure that when the final battle occurred, his followers would be able to fight the way the Book of Revelation said they must. Ginn says it had to be an all-out battle. His people were going to die, but obviously they had to be ready to kill the agents of Babylon. The build-up to the Waco siege wasn't random. It was the inevitable result of Koresh's apocalyptic manipulation that had convinced his followers they were soldiers. In God's final war government, agents began investigating the Branch Davidians over charges that children at the compound were being abused, and that the group was stockpiling weapons on the morning of February 28, 1993. 76 agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms (ATF) arrived at the compound called Mount Carmel, expecting to surprise the group. But Koresh had prepared his followers for exactly this moment. In fact, Koresh had passed out weapons at the compound, so most members of the group were stocked with guns and ammunition. What's more, the branch Davidians knew the ATF was coming. A 3-hour gunfight ensued during which 5 Branch Davidians and 4 federal agents were killed. Almost 1/3 of the ATF agents are carried away, bleeding or dead from this fight. Ginn says, before noon on this day, ATF is dragging itself away like a defeated army. The 51-day standoff that followed revealed the true extent of Koresh's psychological control over his followers. Inside Mount Carmel, David's followers were waiting for something to happen. He had promised them that they were going to be translated into great glory. Nothing was happening. Nobody trusted the other side, and nobody really could communicate with the other side, because if people don't want to understand what the other person's saying, it doesn't make any difference. How hard you try to negotiate, nothing's going to happen. Until finally, towards the end, Koresh said that if he would be allowed to write out his explanation of the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation and get those out to religious leaders in the country, he and his followers would come out. That was his promise. Even as negotiations continued, Koresh maintained absolute control, using the siege itself as proof of his prophetic abilities and further binding his followers to his apocalyptic vision. The Waco siege, also known as the Waco Massacre, was the siege by U.S. federal government and Texas state law enforcement officials of a compound belonging to the religious cult known as the Branch Davidians between February 28th and April 19th, 1993. The Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh, were headquartered at Mount Carmel Center Ranch in unincorporated McLennan County, Texas, 13 miles 21 kilometers northeast of Waco. The final tragedy on April 19, 1993, demonstrated the ultimate horrific consequence of Koresh's psychological manipulation. On April 19, 1993, agents moved to take decisive, some say, extreme or unwarranted action in an attempt to lure Koresh and his followers out. They began launching a tear gas assault. The building caught fire. The cause of the fire is still debated, and 76 Branch Davidians, which included 28 children, died in the flames. Koresh, then 33, died of a gunshot wound to the head during the course of the fire. No one knows who killed him or if he killed himself. The psychological manipulation techniques Koresh used weren't unique to him. They represent a broader pattern of how cult leaders systematically destroy individual autonomy and replace it with absolute dependence. Cults are dangerous because they typically rely on deceptive and authoritarian practices to make members dependent on and obedient to the group. A cult is an organized group whose purpose is to dominate cult members through psychological manipulation and pressure strategies. Cults are usually headed by a powerful leader who isolates members from the rest of society. The techniques Koresh employed: isolation from outside influences, gradual normalization of abuse and violence, creation of an us versus them mentality, and exploitation of fundamental human needs for belonging and purpose, represent a playbook that has been used by dangerous cult leaders throughout history as they indoctrinate new members. Many cults separate them from their families, friends, and jobs, slowly remaking their identities to suit the group. They may force recruits to surrender their money belongings and bodies to the cult's leader and other members. They may use punishment, deprivation, and other tactics to wear them down. These efforts, which sometimes include threats, make new members dependent on and afraid to leave the group. Fully indoctrinated members often engage in behavior they never would have considered in their former lives. Koresh's story serves as a chilling reminder that the capacity for psychological manipulation exists within human nature, and that ordinary people seeking meaning and community can become victims of those who understand how to exploit our deepest vulnerabilities. Receptive people are those who are looking to escape something such as an unhappy life situation and to belong, be accepted, and find meaning. Cults prey upon the vulnerable among us, such as teenage runaways, drug addicts, abuse survivors, those who have lost someone close to them through death or a breakup, those suffering from insecurity or mental health issues, or anyone who feels disconnected from society. Understanding the manipulation techniques used by leaders like David Koresh isn't just about historical knowledge. It's about recognizing that these same psychological vulnerabilities exist in all of us, and that the price of freedom, both political and psychological, is eternal vigilance against those who would use our deepest human needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning as weapons against us. The tragedy at Waco stands as a stark warning that charismatic authority, unchecked by critical thinking and outside accountability, can transform sincere spiritual seeking into a journey toward destruction. The children who died in that fire never had a choice in Koresh's apocalyptic fantasies, but their deaths serve as an eternal reminder of what happens when we surrender our individual judgment to those who claim divine authority over our lives. From the ashes of Mount Carmel, we must learn that no leader, no matter how charismatic or convincing, should ever be granted absolute authority over other human beings, and that the moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our critical thinking to someone who promises simple answers to life's complex questions, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that destroyed so many lives in the Texas desert on that April morning in 1993. But let's shift our focus to a very different kind of cult, one that operated not through religious extremism, but through the sophisticated manipulation of success, wealth, and self-improvement. Meet Keith Raniere, the founder of Nexivem, a group that masqueraded as a personal development company while secretly operating as a sex trafficking organization that branded women with the leader's initials. Keith Allen Raniere, born August 26, 1960, is an American cult leader who was convicted of a pattern of racketeering activity, including human trafficking, sex offenses, and fraud. Raniere co-founded NextXIVM, a purported self-help multi-level marketing company offering personal development seminars, and headquartered in Albany, New York, operating from 1998 to 2018. NextIVM had 700 members at its height, including celebrities, and the wealthy within NextIVM. Raniere was referred to as Vanguard. Unlike David Koresh, who used religious apocalypticism to control his followers, Raniere employed a much more sophisticated approach that appealed to educated, successful people seeking personal growth. In 1998, American businessman and self-help guru Keith Raniere founded NextIVM, a multi-level marketing company in Albany, New York. He founded the organization alongside Nancy Salzman, a nurse and trained practitioner of hypnotism and neuro-linguistic programming. It was known for its motivational personal development seminars and even attracted celebrities and social media stars for over 2 decades. However, it eventually became apparent that NextIVM had a much darker side. What made Raniere particularly dangerous was his ability to target intelligent, accomplished individuals who would never consider themselves vulnerable to cult manipulation. The people involved in the inner circle weren't unintelligent, and many of them had already attained impressive levels of success. So how were they tricked into joining such a twisted scheme? According to one attorney who works with victims of multi-level marketing scams, Raniere used skills that are often used to manipulate people. They use a number of techniques to sort of get people to lower their guard and to stop thinking critically, not treating it as a business, but treating it as a way that they're going to fulfill their dreams, he explained. Raniere's manipulation techniques were far more subtle than Koresh's overt religious authoritarianism. Raniere offered an expensive course consisting of 12-hour sessions that taught NextIVM's members not to give in to their gut instincts and selfish emotions. These courses are based on the idea that society forces robotic behavior. As a result, the members of NextIVM learned to not question NextIVM's methods, as doing so would make them too self-centered. This technique of reframing critical thinking as selfishness is a hallmark of sophisticated psychological manipulation. It gradually erodes the victim's ability to trust their own judgment, while positioning the manipulator as the only source of truth, like any other pyramid scheme. NextIVM was built in a way that encouraged its members to recruit others. Of course, this doesn't happen solely because of the commitment of every member. Once money incentives come into the equation, people get interested and the system begins turning over. Not only is money a strong incentive, but women were forced to recruit more members. This meant that the cult grew exponentially, and that members had a harder time leaving once they already recruited other members. Raniere understood that once people became invested in recruiting others, they became psychologically committed to the organization's legitimacy. To admit they had been manipulated would mean acknowledging they had manipulated others, creating a powerful psychological trap. The best recruiters rose up through the ranks of NextIVM's pyramid scheme hierarchy. The higher-ranked members were expected to move closer to the cult's HQ in Albany. Once the members arrived closer to Raniere himself, it became much more difficult to find a way out of the cult. The physical isolation combined with social and financial dependence created multiple layers of control that made escape increasingly difficult. What happens if a member actually tries to go against any of the NextIVM cult's ideas? Among the ways by which members were pushed back in line, one of the victims mentions an especially effective method, simply excluding the wrongdoer. Members found wanting in obedience had their reality lifelines severed and were further left out by being secluded. This exclusion technique is particularly effective because it leverages the human need for social connection and belonging. One of the former members mentioned being left in a room for 2 years after Raniere found out she had a personal relationship with another man. While cruel, such extreme measures proved effective to keep members in line. Bitter desperation grew in Nuxivam's oppressed clientele until it boiled over, and the cult's systemic abuse was exposed. But the true horror of NXIVM was revealed in the discovery of DOS's secret subgroup within the organization. Like NXIVM, the group known as DOS, an acronym for a Latin phrase, roughly translated as Master over Obedient Women, was structured as a multi-level organization in which members were expected to recruit others. In DOS, Raniere was considered Grand Master. Recruits were referred to as slaves. In October, a judge sentenced Raniere to 120 years in prison for his role in an offshoot of NXIVM, in which women were treated as slaves, forced to have sex with him, and were branded in their pelvic areas with his initials. Raniere 60 was convicted on charges including racketeering and sex trafficking. The psychological manipulation techniques used in NXIVM demonstrate how modern cult leaders have evolved beyond crude brainwashing to sophisticated systems of control that exploit contemporary desires for self-improvement and success. Research shows that powerful cult leaders are highly adept at using psychological manipulation to control followers. Cult members typically don't realize they are being brainwashed. Research shows that powerful cult leaders are highly adept at using psychological manipulation to control followers. Cult members typically don't realize they are being brainwashed. The reason that people often join doomsday cults in the first place is due to a manipulative trick known as a love bomb. This is when a cult, from the leaders down to the newest recruits, showers someone with affection, care, and support. The reason that people often join doomsday cults in the first place is due to a manipulative trick known as a love bomb. This is when a cult, from the leaders down to the newest recruits, showers someone with affection, care, and support. Not only is this intended to make people feel welcome and at home, but it subtly and insidiously establishes a dependency relationship. Everything you need or want has to come through the cult at first. This is generously given after a while. It's given with a few conditions attached in the end. Affection and love are given only to those who behave exactly as they are supposed to. Raniere's case demonstrates how these classic manipulation techniques can be adapted for contemporary audiences who might reject overt religious or political extremism but remain vulnerable to promises of personal transformation and empowerment. Ross pointed out that the techniques used in the movie are the same ones that were used by Raniere only a few years ago. The leaders' names change, but the game doesn't change. Ross said, in other words, NXIVM may appear to be a shocking modern cult, but Raniere's methods of control are nothing new. The sophistication of modern cult leaders like Raniere lies not in inventing new manipulation techniques, but in adapting ancient methods of psychological control to contemporary contexts. They understand that educated modern people are unlikely to fall for obvious religious extremism, but remain vulnerable to appeals to their desire for success, self-improvement, and belonging to an elite group. Both David Koresh and Keith Raniere, despite their vastly different approaches, shared certain fundamental characteristics. They were both skilled at identifying psychological vulnerabilities in their targets. They both gradually escalated their demands and normalized increasingly extreme behavior. They both created insular communities that cut members off from outside influences, and they both positioned themselves as indispensable sources of truth and meaning. The two key themes that were identified encompass the fluidity of manipulation tactics that cult leaders use when challenged, and the shift in manipulation tactics from fostering a view of themselves as a prophet to claiming that they are a savior or messiah. The findings show that cluster B personality traits exist on a spectrum and are often used in tandem to master manipulation tactics. The study may contribute to positive social change by improving experts' understanding of how cult leaders work, which could enable experts to devise interventions to help potential cult followers and their families. Understanding these patterns isn't just academic, it's essential for protecting ourselves and others from similar manipulation in whatever forms it may take. In our contemporary world, the techniques used by leaders like Koresh and Raniere haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved and adapted to new contexts and new vulnerabilities. The victims of these cults deserve to be remembered not as weak-minded followers, but as people who were systematically manipulated by expert practitioners of psychological control. Their stories serve as warnings about the importance of maintaining critical thinking, questioning authority, and staying connected to people and principles that keep us grounded in reality. The legacy of groups like the Branch Davidians and NXIVM continues to influence how we think about religious freedom, personal autonomy, and the responsibility of both governments and individuals to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their deepest human needs for meaning, belonging, and transcendence. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most dangerous cults aren't always the most obviously bizarre. They're often the ones that seem most normal, most appealing to educated, reasonable people. The lesson isn't that we should avoid all spiritual or self-improvement communities, but that we must remain vigilant against those who demand absolute obedience, claim exclusive access to truth, and gradually isolate us from the people and principles that keep us grounded. The moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our individual judgment to someone who promises simple answers to life's complex problems, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that destroyed so many lives at Mount Carmel and in the NXIVM organization. These stories remind us that eternal vigilance isn't just the price of political freedom, it's the price of psychological freedom as well. In a world where charismatic leaders continue to prey on our deepest human needs, we must remember that no one person has all the answers, no matter how convincing they might seem, and that the greatest protection against manipulation is maintaining our capacity for independent thought, our connections to diverse sources of information, and our commitment to questioning any authority that demands our absolute surrender. Based on my research and the provided script context, I'll continue Part 8 of the YouTube script about dangerous cults that history tried to erase, maintaining the established tone and structure. The shadow world of psychological manipulation runs deeper than most people imagine, because these cult leaders understood something terrifying about human nature. They knew that the right combination of isolation, fear, and false hope could turn even the most intelligent people into willing participants in their own destruction. Keith Raniere, the mastermind behind NXIVM, proved that modern cults don't need religious extremism to destroy lives. TV actress Allison Mack, Center, was sentenced on June 30th, 2021 to 3 years for her role in the alleged cult. Mack was also fined $20,000 and will have to do 1,000 hours of community service as part of her sentence. But the real horror wasn't just what happened to individual victims. It was how systematically Raniere dismantled their ability to think for themselves. At her sentencing, Mack expressed remorse. "I made choices I will forever regret," she said, telling the judge she was filled with remorse and guilt. These weren't the words of someone who had been physically coerced. These were the words of someone whose mind had been so thoroughly rewired that she genuinely believed she was helping people while participating in their abuse. The sophistication of Raniere's manipulation went far beyond crude brainwashing techniques. Another tactic that cult leaders use is to slowly and gradually escalate the level of control they exert over their followers. This can start with simple requests, such as asking members to donate large portions of their income to the group, and eventually escalate to more extreme demands. Raniere understood that sudden dramatic changes would trigger resistance, but gradual escalation could normalize almost anything. What makes these modern cults particularly insidious is how they exploit contemporary desires for self-improvement and empowerment. This is a tactic that narcissistic manipulators use in interpersonal relationships, but it also applies to cultic attempts at thought reform. Cult members will spoil you with attention and affection in order to make you feel connected and important, and people keep coming back for the love drug. Love bombing isn't just about making people feel good, it's about creating an addiction to approval that makes questioning the group feel like emotional suicide. But let's travel back to one of history's most chilling examples of how failed prophecy can explode into mass murder. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God in Uganda became a case study in what happens when religious delusion meets desperate leadership facing accountability. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God was a breakaway movement from the Roman Catholic Church founded in Uganda in the 1980s. The group believed that the apocalypse would occur on December 31, 1999, and to avoid damnation, members had to follow the 10 Commandments very strictly. Leaders even discouraged talking to avoid breaking the 9th commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." Sex and soap were also forbidden. Imagine the level of control required to convince hundreds of people that speaking itself was sinful. The psychological manipulation involved in making basic human communication taboo created an environment where questioning authority became literally unthinkable. As 2000 approached, the group prepared for the end. When the apocalypse didn't come, leaders proposed a new date, March 17th, 2000. When March 17th came and went without divine intervention, the leadership faced a crisis that would expose the true nature of their control. They had promised salvation and delivered nothing but continued suffering and isolation. The members began demanding answers, and more importantly, their money back. The systematic murder that followed wasn't random violence. It was the logical conclusion of a power structure built on absolute control. When that control was threatened, the leadership chose to destroy their followers rather than admit they had been wrong. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever cult leaders face the collapse of their carefully constructed reality. Meanwhile, across the globe, another form of religious persecution was demonstrating how governments themselves can adopt cult-like tactics of control and suppression. The Chinese Communist Party's campaign against Falun Gong practitioners revealed that the techniques of psychological manipulation aren't limited to charismatic religious leaders. In 2007, some people from the true Russian Orthodox Church holed up in a cave in Russia. Why? Because they thought the world was ending. Their leader, Pyotr Kuznetsov, convinced them that leaving the cave meant doom, and even after he was arrested, they stayed put. Some of them later died. This incident shows how completely cult leaders can override basic survival instincts even when they're no longer physically present. The psychological techniques used by these groups follow remarkably similar patterns regardless of their stated ideology or methods. One of the key tactics used by cults is social conditioning. Cult leaders use various techniques to manipulate their members into conforming to their beliefs and behaviors. This can include isolating members from their friends and family, controlling their access to information, and creating a sense of dependency on the group. By isolating members from their support systems and limiting their exposure to outside perspectives, cult leaders are able to control the narrative and prevent members from questioning their beliefs. Isolation isn't just about physical separation. It's about cutting off all sources of alternative information and perspectives. When people lose contact with family, friends, and independent sources of information, they become completely dependent on the cult for their understanding of reality. This makes them incredibly vulnerable to further manipulation and control. Additionally, cults often use a combination of love bombing and gaslighting to manipulate their members. Love bombing is a tactic where members are showered with love and attention in the beginning stages of their involvement with the group. This creates a sense of indebtedness and loyalty to the group. Gaslighting, on the other hand, is a tactic where members are made to doubt their own perceptions and reality. This makes it easier for cult leaders to control and manipulate their members. Gaslighting is particularly effective because it doesn't just change what people believe, it changes their confidence in their own ability to perceive reality. When someone constantly questions your memory, your perceptions, your very understanding of events, you gradually lose trust in your own judgment. This creates a psychological dependency where the manipulator becomes the only reliable source of truth. The international implications of these movements cannot be ignored. On March 20th, 1995, members of Aum Shinrikyo, Supreme Truth, founded by Asahara in the 1980s, released the poisonous nerve gas sarin on 5 crowded subway trains during morning rush hour in Tokyo, killing 13 people and sickening thousands more. Aum Shinrikyo targeted the Kasumigaseki station in the area where many of Japan's government offices are located, as part of what they thought would be an apocalyptic battle with the government. Aum Shinrikyo proved that cults could evolve into sophisticated terrorist organizations capable of developing and deploying weapons of mass destruction. They showed that the traditional boundaries between religious movements and national security threats had become dangerously blurred. Born into a poor family in Japan in 1955, Asahara, real name Chizuo Matsumoto, lost part of his vision at a young age due to illness. He established Aum Shinrikyo as a religious organization that promoted Buddhist and Hindu concepts, along with elements of the Bible and prophecies of Nostradamus. Eventually, Asahara began claiming he could read minds and levitate. In 1990, he and some of his followers ran for parliament but lost. What's particularly chilling about Asahara's story is how political rejection may have triggered his turn toward violence. When his movement failed to gain legitimacy through democratic means, he chose terrorism as an alternative path to power. This pattern of escalation from failed politics to deadly extremism appears repeatedly in cult history. The sophistication of modern cult recruitment makes these groups particularly dangerous because they've learned to adapt their ancient manipulation techniques to contemporary contexts. After all, people are drawn to cults for the same reasons they're drawn to church, family, and the self-improvement section of the bookstore. Cult conversion doesn't happen overnight. Here's a scary thought. A destructive cult might be actively conditioning you right now. Fortunately, you can stop cult recruitment in its tracks by learning the warning signs. Understanding these warning signs isn't just academic knowledge. It's essential protection in a world where manipulation techniques are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Us versus them mentality. If you find that you have a lot of enemies all of a sudden, ask yourself why. Cults invent enemies to help solidify the group identity. When you envision yourself as a missionary for good versus evil, there might be too much at stake for you to abandon your cause. The US versus them mentality is particularly powerful because it makes leaving the group feel like betrayal, not just of the leader, but of righteousness itself, when questioning the group's beliefs becomes equivalent to siding with evil. Critical thinking becomes psychologically impossible. Cults are dangerous because they typically rely on deceptive and authoritarian practices to make members dependent on and obedient to the group. Cults often cut members off from other forms of social and financial support and pose both physical and psychological risks to members of the group. The human cost of these psychological manipulation techniques extends far beyond the immediate victims. Understanding the process of traumatic narcissism helps explain why individuals join cults and why it can be so difficult for them to leave. The combination of unresolved trauma, a fragmented sense of self, and the manipulation tactics employed by cult leaders creates a powerful psychological grip on cult members. Breaking free from this grip often requires intensive therapy and support to heal the underlying wounds and rebuild a healthy sense of self. Survivors often struggle for years or decades to rebuild their sense of self and their ability to trust their own judgment. The psychological damage inflicted by these groups can last a lifetime, creating ripple effects that impact families, communities, and entire societies. What makes studying these cults particularly important is recognizing that the techniques they used remain virtually unchanged. Psychologists don't use the term brainwashing anymore. It's just not a thing. They talk about influence, persuasion, manipulation, and coercion, but the idea that someone's brain can be hijacked has been thoroughly debunked, in large part because it's untestable. But just because cultic experts no longer think in terms of brainwashing and deprogramming doesn't mean that regular people aren't still in danger of being manipulated by bad actors and dark psychology forces. The only way to protect yourself is to stay informed about these mind control techniques, so you'll be able to recognize them in the wild. The same psychological vulnerabilities these leaders exploited exist in all of us. The capacity for both transcendent good and horrific evil lies within human nature, and the difference often comes down to the circumstances we encounter and the choices we make when faced with powerful but dangerous ideas. Most individuals don't recognize. The group they're joining is considered a cult. Individuals who are attracted to groups that are considered cults may have certain vulnerabilities that make them more likely to join, such as anxiety or substance abuse problems. Another study found that many cult members experience attachment insecurity prior to joining a cult. Their insecurities may drive them toward a group that promises acceptance. The victims of these cults deserve to be remembered not as weak-minded followers, but as people who were systematically manipulated by expert practitioners of psychological control. Their stories serve as warnings about what happens when our deepest human needs for meaning, belonging, and transcendence are weaponized against us by those who understand human psychology better than their victims understand themselves. The legacy of groups like NXIVM, the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments, and Aum Shinrikyo continues to influence how governments, societies, and individuals approach the challenge of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their deepest human needs for the darkest possible purposes. These movements prove that eternal vigilance isn't just the price of political freedom, it's the price of psychological freedom as well. In a world where charismatic leaders continue to prey on our fundamental human vulnerabilities, we must remember that no one person has all the answers, no matter how convincing they might seem. The moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our critical thinking to someone who promises simple solutions to life's complex problems, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that have destroyed so many lives throughout history. The techniques may evolve, the packaging may change, but the fundamental patterns remain the same: isolation, manipulation, gradual escalation, and ultimately the exploitation of our deepest human needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most dangerous cults weren't always the most obviously bizarre. They were often the ones that seemed most normal, most appealing to educated, reasonable people. The lesson isn't that we should avoid all spiritual or self-improvement communities, but that we must remain vigilant against those who demand absolute obedience, claim exclusive access to truth, and gradually isolate us from the people and principles that keep us grounded in reality. Understanding these patterns isn't just about historical knowledge, it's about protecting ourselves and others from similar manipulation in whatever forms it may take in our contemporary world. The human capacity for both great good and great evil remains constant, and the price of freedom, both personal and collective, is remaining forever watchful against those who would use our highest aspirations to serve their lowest purposes. But the psychological landscape of cult manipulation runs far deeper than most people realize, because these predators understood something truly terrifying about human nature. They discovered that our most beautiful qualities, our capacity for love, trust, and hope, could be weaponized against us with surgical precision. The fundamental truth is that humans have a fundamental need for belonging and purpose. We want to feel like we are a part of something bigger than ourselves and that our lives have meaning. Cults prey on this need by offering a sense of community and purpose to their members. This isn't weakness, this is what makes us human, but in the hands of psychological predators, these needs become vulnerabilities to be exploited. Research has shown that most people can be susceptible to cult influence under the right conditions. The people who are the most susceptible to recruitment are stressed, emotionally, vulnerable, have tenuous or no family connections, or are living in adverse socioeconomic conditions. But here's what makes this particularly chilling. Anyone can become vulnerable given the right circumstances and enough pressure. The sophistication of modern cult recruitment makes these groups particularly dangerous because they've learned to adapt their ancient manipulation techniques to contemporary contexts originally coined by the Moonies. Love bombing is more or less self-explanatory. Having identified a stressed, emotionally vulnerable target, cults flood that person with affection, flattery, and validation. After convincing you that they're the best friends you've ever had and bombarding you with the cult's ideology, the cultist's next job is to make sure they hang on to you. There's a variety of techniques they can use to accomplish this, but these usually involve iteratively subjecting the cult recruit to terror and love. This creates what psychologists call trauma bonding, where victims become emotionally attached to their abusers. When we are frightened, we don't simply run away from the fear, but run to a safe haven to someone. And that someone is usually a person to whom we feel attached, but when the supposed safe haven is also the source of the fear, then running to that person is a failing strategy, causing the frightened person to freeze trapped between approach and avoidance by keeping cult members totally off balance. In this way, cults increase their members' dependency on the leader, ensuring they retain control. The international implications of these psychological manipulation techniques cannot be ignored. Cult leaders use various techniques to manipulate their members into conforming to their beliefs and behaviors. This can include isolating members from their friends and family, controlling their access to information, and creating a sense of dependency on the group. One of the most insidious tactics employed by cults is the systematic isolation of members from their family and friends. This controlling behavior serves a dual purpose. It weakens the individual's support system, making them more dependent on the group, and it eliminates outside influences that might challenge the cult's teachings. Suddenly, the cult becomes the members' whole world, their only source of companionship and validation. What makes these techniques particularly effective is how they exploit cognitive vulnerabilities that exist in all of us. Cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when holding contradictory beliefs, is another psychological state that cults often exploit by gradually introducing beliefs or practices that conflict with a person's existing values. Cults can slowly erode their sense of reality and moral compass. We take language for granted. It can work invisibly and powerfully to discourage independent thinking, and can often discourage questioning in order to encourage conformity. The manipulation isn't just about what cult leaders say. It's about how they systematically rewire their victims' ability to think critically. Understanding the process of traumatic narcissism helps explain why individuals join cults and why it can be so difficult for them to leave. The combination of unresolved trauma, a fragmented sense of self, and the manipulation tactics employed by cult leaders creates a powerful psychological grip on cult members. Breaking free from this grip often requires intensive therapy and support to heal the underlying wounds and rebuild a healthy sense of self. The human cost of these psychological manipulation techniques extends far beyond the immediate victims. Cult manipulation can also result in psychological trauma. The tactics used by cults to maintain control over members can be emotionally and mentally damaging, leading to feelings of fear, anxiety, and depression. In some cases, cult members may also experience physical abuse, including beatings and other forms of violence, which can result in physical and emotional scars that can last a lifetime. Cult leaders often use manipulation, charisma, and a whole range of abusive tactics to draw their followers. Experts who study cults suggest the human need for comfort prompts people to seek out others or things to soothe their fears and anxieties. They understand that people don't join cults. They join what appears to be solutions to their deepest problems. There's a bit of a false belief out there that cult recruits tend to be mentally ill, but this usually isn't the case. Cults don't want completely unpredictable people to join. Rather, they want relatively stable people who can work to forward the cult's goal and donate money. Relatively healthy people going through stressful periods, therefore, are their prime targets. The victims of these cults deserve to be remembered not as weak-minded followers, but as people who were systematically manipulated by expert practitioners of psychological control. Cults are a complex and dangerous phenomenon that can have devastating effects on their members and society as a whole. By understanding the tactics used by cults and the psychology behind their success, we can better protect ourselves and our loved ones from falling prey to their manipulative tactics. Remember to always question what you are being told. Stay connected to your support system and educate yourself about the warning signs of cults. Understanding these psychological manipulation techniques isn't just about historical knowledge. It's about recognizing that these same vulnerabilities exist in all of us. The techniques used by cult leaders, isolation, love bombing, fear manipulation, and gradual escalation of commitment remain virtually unchanged because human psychology itself remains constant. Hand in hand with isolation comes the cultivation of an us versus them mentality. Cults thrive on creating a stark division between their members and the outside world. This black and white thinking reinforces the idea that only the cult holds the truth, and that everyone else is misguided, evil, or doomed. It's a powerful psychological tool that binds members more tightly to the group, while fostering a deep distrust of outsiders. The legacy of groups like Nexiv, the People's Temple, Aum Shinrikyo, and countless others continues to influence how governments, societies, and individuals approach the challenge of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their deepest human needs for the darkest possible purposes. Cults have been a part of human history for centuries, and their use of psychological manipulation to control members continues to be a topic of concern and fascination. This article delves into the strategies employed by cult leaders to manipulate and control their followers and explores their destructive impact throughout history. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most dangerous aspect of cult psychology isn't the dramatic rituals or bizarre beliefs. It's the gradual, systematic erosion of individual judgment and autonomy. The moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender our critical thinking to charismatic authority figures, is the moment we become vulnerable to the same dark forces that destroyed so many lives throughout history. These 33 examples represent just a fraction of the dangerous cults that have emerged throughout history, each one a reminder that the capacity for both transcendent good and horrific evil exists within human nature, and that the difference often lies in the circumstances we encounter and the choices we make when faced with powerful but dangerous ideas. The techniques may evolve, the packaging may change, but the fundamental patterns remain the same: isolation, manipulation, gradual escalation, and ultimately the exploitation of our deepest human needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning. The price of freedom, both personal and collective, is remaining forever watchful against those who would use our highest aspirations to serve their lowest purposes.